Welcome to this almost final session of the Zero Project Conference 2022. But before we start this session in these dire, catastrophic times, let's have some 30 seconds of silence. Arguably, there is one challenge in accessibility that's common in every country, in every city in the world, and it's a challenge that has not been really solved, and it's time to do that. And I think as a group of experts globally from different sectors, different approaches that came together and create a solution that might work to solve this issue, and the issue is the accessibility of sidewalks, of pathways. I'm happy that we have joined joined up with G3ICT and their team and their project members for this session, which is good, and I hope it is also an eye-opener how this global challenge can be approached, and I think we all can look forward to some 45 minutes of exciting insights how this project is going to work and how they're going to involve artificial intelligence in solving this problem. Having said all that, my role is simply as the convener, as the moderator, and I'm glad that I can hand over to James Thurston, a trusted and long-term partner of the Zero Project, and who will chair this session, and who will introduce the rest of the speakers. So over to you, James.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael. I am James Thurston. By way of descriptive introduction, I'm a white male, middle-aged male with grayish hair. I'm wearing glasses. I have a blue shirt. I'm the vice president of an international NGO, G3ICT. And I'm sorry that this year I can't be there in person with all of you, many friends and colleagues there, but G3ICT is certainly here to be a partner in the Zero Project. For the conference partner channel, we've been actually curating several sessions on important topics like acquired disability and inclusive education and the role of procurement and buying and deploying technology in classrooms, accessible technology, blueprints in communities to support inclusive workplaces. And today we're going to talk about a project to increase inclusion in 5 cities across the Americas. I have to say I've been working on accessibility, inclusion, and technology for nearly 20 years now. And I think this project that I talk about today, is probably one of the most exciting and impactful that I've been involved with in my career in accessibility and inclusion. And that's because we're using data and leading edge technology to solve one of the, as Michael mentioned, one of the biggest challenges, inclusion challenges, that we see in cities around the world. It doesn't matter the global north or the global south. And that challenge really, on the face of it, has nothing to do with technology or data, and it's the accessibility of sidewalks. So along with partners that you'll hear from in a moment, we're working with 5 leading smart cities across the Americas. And there's also cities that have an enormous commitment to inclusion of people with disabilities. Cities that we're working with are Gran Valparaiso in Santiago, Chile, Sao Paulo in Brazil, Quito, Ecuador, and Los Angeles here in the United States, where I am. Importantly, Microsoft is both supporting this work and actively engaged as a partner at every step in the project, which is incredibly valuable to us, and we're very grateful for that partnership. As we get started here, let me just give you a little bit of context about why we're so excited about this project and to be discussing it with you today. We know that today, smart cities, cities that are using data and using technology, they're failing people with disabilities. 6 years ago, G3ICT launched a global initiative called Smart Cities for All. And we launched it because we were seeing worldwide that smart solutions, technology deployments in cities, the use of data in cities, we're not really driving greater accessibility. And in reality, we're making the digital divide for people with disabilities in cities worse, not better. So we know from a global study that we did at that time that this lack of ICT, of technology accessibility and smart city initiatives worldwide negatively impacts people with disabilities in many different ways. But the number one area that survey respondents, experts, and people with disabilities told us was in the area of transportation and mobility, that was one of the biggest impact areas of a lack of accessibility of technology in cities, in smart cities. We know that in cities worldwide, mobility and transportation, getting around is key to better outcomes for people with disabilities, whether it's in education or employment, healthcare, financial security, emergency response, access to justice, social and cultural institution. All of these outcomes in all of these depend in some part on mobility, on transportation, on getting around the city. And I know in my work with cities around the world, again, it doesn't matter if it's a big city or a small city, if it's in a developed or emerging economy. The problem that typically comes up first when I'm working with cities on being inclusive and accessible, particularly with disability commissioners of these cities, is their struggle to get a better understanding of the accessibility of their streets and sidewalks. Cities have thousands of miles of sidewalks. New York City has almost 13,000 miles of sidewalks. They also have thousands of corners at intersections. And sidewalks are at the heart of accessible, sustainable, and resilient cities. But today, as many of you know, and certainly we know from our work with cities, too often sidewalks are not safe and they're not accessible to everyone. So like today's smart cities, today's sidewalks are failing pedestrians with disabilities. People with disabilities today too often do not have detailed, accurate information that they need to identify and choose trips that are safe, accessible, and appropriate for them as individuals. And while there are solutions out there that allow for routing along streets for cars, what's missing in most cities is good information about pedestrian pathways in general and about the accessibility of those pathways in particular. So this project that we'll be talking with you about today is the AI for Inclusive Mobility project, and it's changing that. Thanks to our partnerships with Microsoft and the University of Washington and the cities themselves, which you'll hear from all of them in a moment. I think that the project is unique and powerful because it is this partnership among civil society organizations, technology leaders in the cities and communities in those cities. And the project is really showing how data and technology can solve one of the most persistent inclusion challenges in cities, the accessibility of sidewalks. So with that, I'd like to Hector, pull in you for some discussion. Again, first, thank you to Microsoft for being such I think, really a visionary and supportive partner in this work on AI for inclusive mobility in cities. And if you could maybe tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, how Microsoft sees the potential and the reality today for data, AI, leading technologies when it comes to accessibility and inclusion of persons with disabilities. And maybe tell us also a little bit about Microsoft's AI for Accessibility program, which is our primary partner in this work.
Thanks, James. So I'm delighted to be joining this session. I mean, we've been on a journey with the relationship between AI and people's perception of AI and the lives of people with disabilities for the last few years. I've prepared a few slides, so I'm going to take us quickly through those, James, in the room and online. So if I could just bring up the slides first. You know, I actually joined Microsoft at a point when really open discussions about AI with customers were really starting. And when we started talking about AI, particularly in relation to Microsoft products, it was very much focused on the gadget, I'm going to call it, the gimmick. It's not a gimmick, but it's the feature request that would level the playing field for people with disabilities. So when we look at a slide like this, we see that technology today, we can use machines for image recognition, we can use machines for speech recognition and natural language interaction. And so a lot of the focus was really put on the user. and the user perspective. How could this new branch of human technology empower people with disabilities? And this is super important and has driven probably some of our best storytelling in Microsoft all up for the last 5 years. People know about seeing AI, they know about the captions in Teams, but what they probably don't understand is the journey for real life inclusive experiences on those, in that technology. Every time you open up a PowerPoint, it takes the data from your slides for that session. It takes the vocabulary from your slides for that session and then optimizes the automated captions for that presentation that you're giving. Well, that's data. That's not speech to text. That's a specific voice model to drive that better inclusive experience. And so when we first launched the AI for Accessibility program, we started to see a lot of the projects that came to us first were about the tool. And so what I'm showing on slide here is the WeWalk project, which has been an amazing project, looking at how to develop a new generation of smart canes that add extra information for the user. Of course, at the same time, we were running our Soundscape project on better mobility for people who are blind using spatial audio. And so this is super. But what people didn't realize, or don't tend to realize, is that a lot of the focus now within the AI for Accessibility program is moving much more into the data desert. In Seeing AI, I mean, many people around the globe are familiar with the Seeing AI product. And so it recognizes banknotes for people who are blind. That's one of the channels on it. And one of the things that we found out very early was that blind people didn't take the same photos of banknotes or didn't orient banknotes in the same way as somebody who was sighted would do. And so the AI had to represent the lived experience of people who were blind to make it successful. It didn't recognize the money if you didn't take what I would call awkward shots of the money. Not well framed, blurry, out of focus, catching a corner. That data collection is what drove the success of that tool, not does machine learning know what a banknote looks like? I mean, you can get that from Google, right? So it's actually, we've got to work harder to get the data to represent the lived experience of people with disabilities. And so the AI for Accessibility program has started to look at projects that focus much more on the data set as opposed to the tool. And this is where I think it starts to get super exciting, particularly when we start to engage with Microsoft commercially. And so let's have that conversation. Microsoft is doing a lot of work around the world with cities. We're working with the people who are spending the big budgets on digital transformation in cities around the world. And we need to make sure that people with disabilities are not left behind in the systems that they're building. And so partnerships with teams like G3ICT, I've already met Anat before, so I can't wait for Anat to talk about her experiences in terms of mapping, but making sure that data starts to increasingly represent the experience that you want to deliver, not the theoretical experience that you want to deliver, is a really solid conversation for us to have as Microsoft commercially. Most businesses and organizations, when we engage with them about AI, don't understand that it's a data game either. They think it's about the tool, not the data. And the data, have you heard this phrase, rubbish in, rubbish out? If you put rubbish data in, you get rubbish experiences out. That's going to be exactly the same for the inclusion of people with disabilities in AI-driven experiences moving forward. So the AI for Accessibility program is focusing much more on inclusive data sets. Whenever we meet a grantee and have those initial conversations with them, we're not just focused on the amazing new tool that they're conceiving, we're starting to focus much more on what is the data set that you're actually going to build this on, because we're not going to engage unless you're having that conversation as well. In terms of how it works, James, just to wrap up, Azure credits are cloud credits. It's a $25 million 5-year program, working on various RFPs, so it's not just a free-for-all, it's very kind of coordinated now in terms of its approach. But essentially, that expertise, the Azure credits and the cash to help the projects work is the focus moving forward. And so, James, hopefully that's a decent summary of where we've got so far.
Hector, I think that's perfect and a great way to sort of link into our guests here that will speak in a minute. And great that you focus on these data deserts and really the key role that data is playing. The tools are also important, but the data behind them is what is being transformative in the cities that you'll hear about in our conversation today. And I should say that the AI for Accessibility program at Microsoft actually brought us, G3ICT, our nonprofit that is working around the world, and our country representatives, Katherine, who will be speaking in a minute, is one of those for Ecuador. But they partnered, they saw the opportunity to partner us with Dr. Anat Caspi in the University of Washington, so that we can start using data and deploying her great solution, the university's great solution, in cities around the world. And so with that, and we appreciate Microsoft having the vision and the relationships and networks actually to say, hey, we think G3ICT and the University of Washington and Anat's work could fit well together and be quite impactful. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Caspi. Anat, if you want to introduce yourself and then jump right in, I'm sure people are eager to hear more about the data and the solutions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? All right. There is a set of slides if you'd like to bring them up. Fantastic. So yes, as James mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about Open Sidewalks, which is the name of our data project, and how collaborative data approaches to accessible smart cities can really enhance the data that's persistent for cities and be able to enable downstream jiggers, devices, and applications to be built on top of that data pipeline. So first, I'd like to thank ZeroCon and G3ICT for inviting me to participate today. As James mentioned, my name is Anat Caspi. I'm a brunette woman wearing glasses and a tweed jacket. I'm speaking against a background of my home. And I'm the director of the Taskar Center for Accessible Technology as part of the Paul G. Allen School for Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington. Our center's mission is to take technology research, develop it to deployable form, and then sustainably offer end products to enhance independence and access to community living for people with disabilities. So accessible smart cities is a topic that's been on my mind for a very long time, and particularly this past year. But the problem that was faced that James mentioned is a problem that is endemic to a lot of different cities. Next slide, please. So when we were introduced to G3ICT, they had just basically finished the discovery phase of a project that was funded by AI for Accessibility. Next slide. It's not advancing. Oh, fantastic. Thank you. And so G3ICT, through the discovery phase, identified the problem and the opportunity. And so I won't reiterate what James had already mentioned, but the idea was to really discover some of the common challenges that cities were facing. And really a primary concern that kept creeping up was the accessibility of streets and sidewalks. Next slide, please. And what was important about that aspect of their questioning is that they left it as an open challenge to understand what some of the common concerns in transportation and mobility exist. And by this point, our organization, the Taskar Center, has already been doing a lot of work in the United States, also trying to understand some of the common transportation and mobility challenges for cities, and specifically understanding the data landscape for that problem. Next slide, please. So when thinking about the past year, you know, it's not just that accessible smart cities has been difficult to crack. It's that we have noticed that in times of challenging times, like pandemic times, our social systems that have been leaving certain people disadvantaged and behind demonstrated many more cracks that are still leaving people behind, and even more so than before. So recognizing that people with disabilities often rely on a complex network of different services and data pipelines and supports to stay in their homes and communities. And these systems tended to crumble during state lockdowns and still remain compromised today. So whether it's about having unthinkable public discussions about healthcare rationing, or the civil rights of people with disabilities, or even providing few resources to students with disabilities to adapt to widespread school closures and remote learning situations, it's important to recognize that a lot of these endemic problems are systemic and become even more challenging in times where systems are being challenged, because people who are disadvantaged rely on these systems that crumbled during these challenging times. Next slide, please. So why am I here and what am I going to talk about? So our story, the Taskar Center's story with Sidewalks, actually began in 2013 when I moved to Seattle with my daughter who uses a wheelchair. And we were challenged by trying to understand, where can we go? Where can we park our van and deploy the ramp? Where would we be able to access different community living and community experiences? And it was really clear that the information we needed was not centralized anywhere. And we'd have to go to many different sites and lots of research and potentially ask people for specific resources like PDFs of accessible data. And that was not widely accessible or available, nor was it in a format that was easy to understand. It was really cluttered maps. It had wrong information. It was kind of what I call dead on arrival, because a lot of that info is published in PDFs that are not easily maintainable and updated. So the information was just lacking. And then on top of that, none of that was customizable to us. So if I had to ask a question, oh, is the manual chair going to be able to go there versus is the power chair going to be able to go there? There was no information that helped me actually connect the dots. So the cognitive load of having to take every part of the map and assess if that's going to be accessible to this particular device. And then on top of it, connect a full route. And usually you want a plan B and a plan C because, you know, the data is not always correct. That became really challenging. And so it became really clear that centralizing that kind of data and making it consistent so that it's not just a one-of. You know, you see a lot of one-of projects that create data for a campus or a particular location, but it's really hard to then create those devices and apps that Michael was talking about if there's not a data pipeline that really supports it and makes it accessible in many different regions and locales. So we started building Access Map, which is a customized pedestrian routing application. And this app allows users to personalize their mobility needs. So for example, we were first focused about mobility limitations. So we looked at, can we have users specify their preferences for elevation change? Like, I don't want to go up a hill that's greater than 8% grade. Can we customize it for the use of specific infrastructure? Or do I require a curb ramp? So don't show me any routes that don't have curb ramps. I mean, one of the challenges is that if you open the mass-produced applications that I won't mention by name, there's this basic assumption that all travelers are young, have no mobility limitations, and can go up any infrastructure, even if it's not there, because there's no knowledge of whether there's even a sidewalk to support travel or not, much less to mention curb ramps, etc. So making this assumption has actually trained all of us very poorly to expect that we are all homogeneous when it comes to using sidewalks. But we're not. We're very diverse, and that diversity needs to be exemplified in the data. So a little bit about Access Map. In 2014, we just put together all the information, but there was no routing. By 2017, we'd actually built a network. So that's what you need. You need to not only know where the sidewalks are, but how are they connected? How are the crossings connected to the sidewalks? namely, what are the interfaces that transitions between one environment and another. And by 2019, we had mobile application and an API. And the API here is crucial, again, to speak to what Michael was mentioning, in that not only is AccessMap using that information, but we're publishing it for others to take that information and create something totally different. Maybe instead of mobility limitations, we're focusing on blind and visually impaired users, who would then be able to really specify their preferences about tactile information on the ground, as opposed to foregrounding the elevation changes. Next slide, please. So what is being shown on the screen is kind of a screenshot of AccessMap. Specifically, the visual metaphors here really demote the road. We don't care about the automobile roads. What we really care about are the sidewalks. So you will see lines where the sidewalks are. The color indicates how difficult might that sidewalk be to the user. So the user's preferences are shown on the left, and that's a preference card that users can actually change as they use AccessMap. So as they change their preferences, the color of the sidewalk might change. So if I say that my uphill steepness above 8% grade is actually my uphill steepness maximum might be 5%, I will ratchet that down, and the colors will change based on how that sidewalk refers to my preferences. And that's important because we're saying maps are not static. Maps are actually an actuation of the user. The user, him or herself, is what matters when it comes to the usability of these sidewalks or the infrastructure. And I think that's really important in maps because, again, we're used to viewing maps as something really static, but the ground information of what maps should indicate is what is the infrastructure's relationship to me and my mobility and my personal profile. So that's how AccessMap's routing is built. Next slide, please. What I wanted to show here is, again, that the data pipeline, while we in AccessMap support the lived experience of people with mobility challenges, the same data can be used to support users who are blind or visually impaired. And specifically here, we created, using the same data pipeline, a totally different experience. Unfortunately, it's very visually, the visual primacy of what I'm showing is unfortunate in this case, but the experience is essentially demonstrating that you can specify a user's mobility and their preferences against a totally different context of requiring tactile paving, wanting to have more landmarks. So essentially saying, I'm willing to take a longer route if there are more landmarks to orient me along the way. I wish to avoid stairs altogether. I want more controlled crossings. And so again, I'm willing to go 2 blocks more in order to have a signalized crossing as opposed to an uncontrolled crossing. So the customization of routing is specific to users and having to personalize the routes to everybody's mobility needs. Next slide, please. Okay, so I talked a lot about the jigger, the device, exactly what Michael said we shouldn't really focus on. But the point was that we can create different UIs in order to foreground what part of the data is important to a particular kind of user. And the heterogeneity in the population that we have is really important here, because we can't possibly serve everybody with one app. That is at least my standpoint. But we can serve everybody with the same data pipeline. And the premise is that behind every useful civic tech application or dashboard, there is a complex data pipeline. And we want to provide centralized, reliable, and intuitive recommendations and directions. And in order to do that, public agencies and private companies need those shared human-centered data pipelines and tools. Next slide, please. So that was the first premise of open sidewalks. And the second premise was really to provide reliable, intuitive, and customized travel directions. Stakeholders need objective, detailed, consistent, and standardized data and tools. So specifically, we want to steer clear of subjective labeling. Anytime you're asked, is this place accessible? Well, as we've talked about, there's such a diversity of needs and preferences about mobility. There's no such thing as accessible globally, unless you're talking about it with reference to a particular person or mobility profile. Next slide, please. So what Open Sidewalks does essentially is use AI and computer vision in order to create consistent, standardized data sets about the sidewalk infrastructure or pedestrian infrastructure. And we're very much an open source, open data project because we understand that in order to maintain these data so that we're not just another North American project that dumps data and technology on the world, we want the public and private entities, as well as researchers and agencies, to all be engaged together in the same data infrastructure. And that's actually really important. The openness of data is germane to the sustainability of sidewalk information, particularly because, as Michael has mentioned, a lot of these data types have been deprioritized because we've been so auto-centric in our approaches and not human-centered in our approaches to mobility. There's tons of data about automobile roads and where they can go. And of course, now with smart driving technologies, even more data is being generated about the automobile infrastructure, and very little of it actually addresses the needs of the public with relation to the sidewalk infrastructure. Next slide, please. So what is Open Sidewalks? What I'm showing is a picture of a typical corner. Seems pretty standard in the US, I should say. I think we showed this in one of our presentations in Latin America, and one of the comments were, this looks like the Royal Road. So I should be clear that it is a US-based image. And what we're showing as an overlay is what is some of the data that we would like to collect. Because it's not just about, oh yeah, there's a point here and it's got a curb ramp. As I said before, humans don't travel by flying. We don't just hop from one curb ramp to the next. There has to be the connectivity along the way to connect us from the sidewalk to the curb, from the curb to the crossing, and so on and so forth. And so Open Sidewalks is really about standardizing what we call the transportation layer, the pedestrian network. And having that network requires all these linear features that show sidewalks and curb ramp and crossings, excuse me, and then the points that connect them. Those connections are crucial in understanding what's the real traversability on the ground. What is the information that's needed in order to give somebody an actual route here? Next slide, please. So Open Sidewalk produces this pedestrian network graph, and it includes sidewalks, crossings, and how they are connected. And then what's really crucial, I think, also is that local community decides on the additional priorities. The attributes on the path are really important to prioritize whatever local concerns the community has, so that we're sure that we're centering the voices of people who are actually impacted by the data. And I think that's really important because a lot of projects out there tend to want to collect potentially data, and well, I will mention Google Flow in this context because you often have private partners trying to apply a single model solution to a problem that, while we said these challenges are endemic to many, many cities, possibly all cities, the local challenges are specific to the locale. For example, working in Seattle, it was really clear that elevation changes were really important. So part of what we had to annotate were indoor infrastructure, because people go into public buildings on one level, take the elevator up, and emerge out the other side. in Twin Cities, Minnesota, concerns are totally different. 6 months out of the year, they're snowed in. And so skyways are part of the infrastructure and had to be annotated. Likewise, I'm sure Katherine can talk about some of the local concerns that her team in Ecuador have foregrounded. So I think it's really important to involve community and local concerns and elevate the voices of those who are really impacted by this data collection. Next slide, please. So you will not see the video, but one level of data collection that we do is actually at street level data. So it's kind of like a street view imagery, but we collect it from the sidewalks, and we look at the pedestrian viewpoint. Next slide. But what we ended up using for this particular project was actually a model that we created from using 3 different input types. So one is a map tile. So there is a resource out there. It's called OpenStreetMap. You might know it. It's one of the few really successful data collaboratives that have just exploded in recent years, in particular, because of the joint investment of the public and private entities in this resource. And so that's really the repository where we save all of our all of the data that we infer and predict. But it's also a great resource for road information. So we take the map tile information and we join it with satellite imagery and also some data elevation models. Using our model, we then have predictions about where the sidewalks are and how they are connected. Next slide, please. So what is the benefit? What do you get? I already showed one image of Access Map. Access Map, as we said, had this visual of where the sidewalks are and how they are connected, and allows people to prioritize customized routing on pedestrian ways. And I should say that our users have really ranged much wider than we had ever expected. We get participation from people who are teaching their kids how to ride bikes on the sidewalks, and that's important. People are pushing strollers, people are traveling with suitcases, delivery personnel. And I should also say that as we've produced more and more of this data, there are additional stakeholders that are interested because we can answer different questions other than just, can I get from here to there given my mobility profile, which is the primary question we started out with. The next set of questions are first responders. Can I get from the curb into this particular building? What is my access point? Another question that city planners are asking a lot are, can we predict in a particular environment where we should put a transportation stop, a bus stop? Where should we put a needle exchange program in a way to make it the most accessible to different populations, not just the one human that's modeled in those mass-produced maps, but can we actually look at different types of individuals with different mobility profiles and understand how they will traverse in this environment. So what we're showing in this particular image is Sidewalk Score, which demonstrates the ability to use those mobility profiles and say, okay, within 400 meters, what is the reach of a person, say, with no mobility limitations starting out? Next slide. And then let's change the mobility profile. And now let's look at what is the reach in the same environment from the same starting point for somebody who's using a powered wheelchair. So now we're producing dashboards, not just answering the question of like, how can I get from here to there, but how can a person with this particular mobility be able to traverse this entire environment? And what is the comparative reach for one type of mobility versus another? So we can start asking different equity questions about different environments. And also we can probe further to understand why is a particular mobility profile restricted in this environment, and can we actually improve the infrastructure there in order to improve the overall accessibility of this terrain. Next slide, please. So here we're showing one more example where a manual wheelchair is much more restricted in that environment than a person with powered mobility, and certainly more restricted than what we were seeing as the normative profile there. Next slide, please. So to summarize, our mission is to enable interoperability in mobility and transportation systems because we identify interests that are shared by stakeholders. We work in a co-design process, specifically elevating local voices, and we respond with data formats and shared data infrastructure to support the adoption of standardized data practices. And that was kind of a long-winded way of saying that we need to all work together, particularly for data types that tend to be demoted or not very focused upon, because there are all these different stakeholders and different agencies, different sub-municipal agencies that are interested in this data but don't have the resources to continuously maintain this kind of data. But collectively, we can actually do this. And that's why having a shared resource like in OpenStreetMap would be something that enables that kind of shared interoperable data standardization. Next slide, please. So our approach is having a data collaborative to accessible smart cities. And we maintain that actually it's not just about sidewalks. Our next projects have to do with on-demand transportation, as well as looking at infrastructure inside transit agencies. So different data standards to commonly share and make interoperable the kind of information that travelers with accessibility concerns have across the board, multimodally. So supporting the development and automated collection of these interoperable data is kind of what we do, our claim to fame. And the important part here is that having those local on the ground collaborations is just seminal and germinal to this approach. So we engage stakeholders and partners pretty much in every step of the way. We co-design the human-centered data specifications. We produce the API formats and best practices and hope that people will see the benefits of not just having this one-off data set for Seattle, but now that we have 11 cities on board, that means that using this kind of API and the data standard, somebody downstream will immediately have 11 cities as their potential clients for these downstream jiggers, API apps or devices. And that's really the power in having this kind of collaborative data approach. So I just closed that. Next slide, please. And with that, I will thank you for having me here today.
Great. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, James. Here comes your Uber moderator and the chair of the session. We just got exactly 12 minutes left, so then we have to close the session, just for your information. Back to you.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Thank you. And I think what we heard in Dr. Caspi's remarks were three really important things that made it immediately apparent to me when Microsoft came to us and said, hey, we think you should be partnering with Anat in the University of Washington. Are one, that there's a proven approach to the algorithms in the tools to use the data that Anat and her team have developed, proven and deployed in cities already. So we were excited about that. I think also Anat touched on the utility of this approach and solution, both for individuals wanting to navigate the city, but also for cities themselves for planning purposes. Where should we put that next subway station? And we're seeing cities that we're working with thinking about and planning to use the data in that way. And then importantly, and as the segue to our last bit of the conversation, is the focus on community in user-driven approaches and communities building and defining what those priorities are for deploying the solution in their cities. Our next two speakers have been doing that work for the past 12 months in these 5 cities that we're working with right now. Katherine and Yulia, if you could just introduce yourselves, and then we'll have a brief conversation. Katherine?
Hi, everyone. My name is Katherine Chacón. I'm a brunette woman. I'm 30 years old, and I'm living in Quito, based in Ecuador.
Thank you, Katherine. And Yulia?
My name is Yulia Sarviro. I'm a senior project manager for G3 ICT. I'm a white woman with short blonde hair. And I'm here speaking against the background of my Airbnb apartment in Tallinn, a city which is very friendly to digital nomads.
Fantastic. Thank you both. So we've heard a lot about from Anat the really critical technical side of all this. There would be no AI for inclusive mobility project were it not for the solutions that Anat and team have created. I want to hear from both of you about the sort of human side of it, the community building side of it. And Katherine, maybe starting with you, can you tell us a little bit about the sort of different roles that are critical to success, the kinds of groups and leaders in cities? And by cities, we mean not just governments, but the communities broadly. Who's really critical to success? What kinds of roles and why? And then Yulia, maybe you can chime in on that after.
Well, this project was significant for different stakeholders. In that vision, the participation of public sector, private sector, the academy, federations of persons with disabilities, and civil society organizations was fundamental. And leaders of institutions, technical teams, students, and civil society have different roles, and that's what we have to understand. For example, leaders were in charge of strategic communication to civil society. They mainstreamed the project on their speeches, so in that way, it had more impact to the society. The technical teams were in charge of the execution of the project, guaranteeing sustainability. In the case of Quito, for example, attaching the information to the mobility master plan was really important because in that way we guarantee that sustainability. The academy and the civil society worked really hard on the data collection, and that was fundamental. Each group and all complement the process of execution. Also, all the participants created a great level of sustainability of the project. All the stakeholders now are working on the data collected and implemented as a proper project of each institution.
Thank you, Katherine. And Katherine is our G3ICT country representative in Ecuador, and so has been leading our work on the ground there. We have representatives in 40 countries. And Katherine, I think it's really instrumental how you help to help these partners see how this work aligns with their greater objectives and other objectives, which is really a beautiful aspect of this community-driven approach to the Open Sidewalks solution. Yulia, would you like to introduce yourself, and then, well, you did, but talk about how you're working with some of the other cities and country reps and maybe some of these other roles that are important.
Thank you, James. It is, of course, a pity that we cannot bring here to this audience all our country representatives working in this project. So I will just add to what Katherine already said, that local communities are of tremendous importance in each of the cities for the success of this project. And even though we expected initially that these local communities will be more or less the same, that the list of stakeholders will be more or less the same in each of the cities, we turned wrong. Each city is unique and the stakeholders are unique as well. And while in, let's say in Quito, we have the great engagement of universities and students, we have the interest of other kinds of partners in other cities. For example, in Valparaiso in Chile, there is the non-profit organization which is working on smart city building in Valparaiso. In Providencia in Chile, we see the great involvement of the local municipality. which just wants to make the streets of this municipality more inclusive to everybody. In Los Angeles, we also see the great involvement of the city administration for a variety of reasons. One of them is that Los Angeles is accepting the Olympic Games in foreseeable future, and it is definitely important that the streets are accessible to all the guests. And in São Paulo, we have the involvement of the non-profits of the disability community, which is interested in making sure that the places, public places, are accessible to all. So the variety of partners is very important in each of the cities.
Thank you. And to emphasize, I think it was important to G3ICT and to Anat and the university and to Microsoft that people with disabilities in their organizations were involved in instrumental roles in all 5 cities. That was, I think, critical to all of us. So maybe just brief answers to one more question, and then we can check with Hector to see if there's any questions there. Any lessons learned or important things you grew to understand in terms of community building and support of projects like these and the work that we've been doing over the past 12 months in these 5 cities? Katherine?
Sure, thanks. I think it's essential to involve all these stakeholders because all of them were working with different roles, and that permanent communication is a good strategy to work with them. The different actors have to get in touch with the project and feel they are not alone in this process. I think that creating some strategies with the cities, for example, with each of these stakeholders was the most important part of this project. One has a benefit, a specific benefit. And when they feel involved in this project, they started creating some strategies as their proper. I had to make some research to promote that specific benefit. And for example, working with the universities, they have this role of investigation and to engage with the community. This project focuses on both requirements and complements their study program. In the same way, for example, for the municipality, everyone is working on the SDGs achievement, and especially to have an inclusive city. This project complements that program, and so they adopted it as part of their strategies, and those are things that I learned along the process. I think that this makes that the city can create some improvement indicators that they can show not just only to the civil society, also to promote them into the world as best practices. I think that the creation of inclusive urban politics also was one of the achievements that in the case of Quito, they can improve. And they established some politics as part of their own, and the city can develop or strengthen its regulation. They created baseline that they have now with all this information. That big data that they have now has to be complemented by each of these cities that participated in this community.
Thank you, Katherine, for spotlighting the utility of this kind of work into the data to broader objectives. Yulia, just really quick, any lessons learned specifically about building community in cities in support of projects like this?
Well, I would say that the example of Quito is very interesting with, of course, engagement of the universities and the students. But I think which is even more important is the great engagement of persons with disabilities into this work and into the dialogue, and actually in the partner work with the students. Just to explain them why it is important for the disability community in Quito. And I think the cooperation with the DPOs is very important in this situation. Also, as we see in some of the places, well, Microsoft is our great partner and a leader in the field of accessibility in many instances and many senses, but we see that our work, for example, in Latin America would be close to impossible without the partnership with Microsoft. First of all, Microsoft LATAM team, and specifically with Microsoft Brazil, which is the sign of the fact that it's very beneficial to have these public-private partnerships built, and even three-party partnerships with the civil society as well. So all the partners in all the sectors are inevitable for the success of such large-scale projects.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think a great way to end our part of this, and Hector, in a second, we'll kick it back to you, but we're collecting these lessons learned, and Anat and the University of Washington and G3ICT, our country representatives around the world are thinking about these lessons learned and how we scale this sort of activity globally to other cities. So please do reach out and be in touch if you can see utility for this kind of solution in your city. Hector, we'll kick it back to you.
Thanks, James. I think my general reflection on this is just how replicable it is. We can do this everywhere, and I think the fact that you were able to kind of knock against an already open door at Microsoft Brazil is partly to do with the kind of the confidence we're trying to build regionally on the topic of accessibility. Giving people, in inverted commas, permission to do disability projects is part of this. Microsoft, I've learned, I've only been with Microsoft for 5 to 6 years, and we have this amazing convening power. We know the universities, we know the government organizations, we're already doing so much work with them, but people are sometimes scared of getting in and working on a project like this unless we've done that culture work. So what I'm looking forward to, James, if I'm honest, is starting to build some very specific replication globally with you. So congratulations for everything you've done so far.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you so much.
James, any closing words? Because we have to wrap up the session in 1 minute now.
No, I think Anat and Katherine and Yulia and Hector have said it best. You can see the critical pieces here of data, technology, solutions from the University of Washington, guidance and leadership and participation by technology leaders like Microsoft, and then the role on the sort of human side of convening and community building of a civil society organization like us. And the exciting thing is that it's working. And so we're thrilled to be looking forward in deploying it in more places.
Thanks a lot. Thanks to all the participants. I think it was a great project, and please go forward and keep us posted. Thanks.